All right. Our next question is actually from two different listeners. They're tracking on the same thing. They have a question about Melchizedek. And Sean in West Virginia asks, could you explain what views and beliefs early Christians or earlier Jews had about Melchizedek? Who was he? What was the significance of his relationship with Abraham and his relationship with Christ? Is there an understanding or perspective that those early believers had that gets missed with us? And Jessica echoes the same stuff. She wants to know if there's some biblical traditions about Melchizedek, and I assume he's a divine being since it says having no beginning and no end, but I know there's special significance since Jesus is referred to as a priest after him, not the Levites. Or is Paul perhaps just describing him as another embodiment of Yahweh, like the angel of the Lord?
Let me just make one quick note here. The questioner sort of assumes that Paul wrote Hebrews. Paul, and he may have. Nobody knows who wrote Hebrews, but outside of Hebrews, you don't have Melchizedek referred to in the New Testament. All the references are in Hebrews 5, 6, and 7, most of them in 7. But it doesn't really matter, for the sake of the question. The short answer is, and this whole subject is a mess. The short answer is, what did ancient Jews, think about Melchizedek? Oh, lots of things. There is no one view. There are several views, and they are at many points, mutually contradictory. The whole Melchizedek thing is a really difficult topic because there are so many ambiguities in both testaments about who this guy was and why he's even mentioned. I would say the topic deserves, I was going to say one episode. I actually think Melchizedek deserves to be 2 episodes on the podcast. One Old Testament, basically Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, and then the next one, a follow-up on Second Temple stuff in the New Testament. So we should do that. We should devote a 2-part mini-series to Melchizedek. But here I'll make a few comments. And Trey, you said at the beginning, sometimes the answers generate more questions. Well, that's what we got here going on. And Melchizedek's sort of like the poster child for, this is really messy, messy stuff in Scripture in terms of our understanding and what we're able to really discern and feel confident about. There isn't a whole lot here. So the difficulties could be summarized this way. I'll just list a few. First, we have an Old Testament description, this is Genesis 14, which has several clear attachments to a Canaanite context. That is an extra biblical context, a non-Israelite context. So because that's the case, how we think about Melchizedek, if we're just in Genesis 14, is going to be different than the way we think about Melchizedek, even in Psalm 110, and especially in the New Testament. So we've got a bit of a disconnect there. Second, if you go to Psalm 110, that has some notorious textual problems. Psalm 110 is probably on a short list of passages that has the most text-critical problems in the Hebrew Bible. You got Psalm 68's got a few doozies. You got Psalm 22's got a few doozies. And you go to Psalm 110, again, it's going to be in the short list of passages that have some really gnarly things going on that matter for interpretation. Some of the key phrases associated with Melchizedek are where some of these problems are. Third, you've got several Melchizedek traditions in Second Temple Judaism, in intertestamental Judaism. And again, at points, they do not agree with each other. Fourth, you have Hebrews 7. There are things you read about in Hebrews 7 like this, without beginning or end kind of thing, that you just won't find in the Old Testament, and you won't even find them in other Second Temple Jewish texts. So how are we supposed to take this? Fifth, again, just sort of a general summation, you've got disagreements between all 4 of those preceding items I just listed. There is no consistent picture. And so that, again, has created kind of this maelstrom of what do we do with Melchizedek? Again, it's a really, really difficult, thorny issue. I'm going to give you some examples here. I don't want to just create a list and then not give you specifics. So a few examples. The name, let's just start with the name, Melchizedek. You think, well, surely that's simple. It means king of righteousness. Well, If you're paying attention to Hebrew morphology, in other words, the spelling of the name, it shouldn't mean that. The reason is if you've had Hebrew, you'll understand this. But so for those in the audience who've had, it breaks down to Melchizedek. Now you'd think you have a simple construct chain there. Noun 1, noun 2, X of Y, but you don't. Because of the E, the Y ending on the first noun, Melchizedek. By rule of Hebrew grammar, you are not supposed to have an attached suffix between two nouns in the construct state, but that's what you got here. So you can't really translate it King of Righteousness. It would be better to say my king is righteous. It's kind of the same idea, but it's again, it's not really the same idea. King of Righteousness, my king is righteous. Those are two related but kind of different concepts. So even the name is controversial. In fact, if you want to be really literal, you could translate it, and many scholars do, as my king is Tzedek. That's the second noun there that some would translate righteous or righteousness. My king is Tzedek. And you say, well, why would scholars do something goofy like that? Why not just go with my king is righteous? Yes, they can be grammar nerds and say we can't say king of righteousness, but let's just go with my king is righteous. What's this thing with my king is Tzedek? That's just odd. Well, there's actually a Canaanite deity named Tzedek. And since this is pre-Israelite, this is the era before Jerusalem, king of Salem, before Jerusalem became Israelite, before David's conquest of it. We're not in the land. We don't have the promised land thing yet. This is Abraham in Genesis 14. This is Canaanite turf. So Melchizedek could have been named after this non-Israelite deity. Okay, I'm Melchizedek. My king is Tzedek, this pagan deity. Well, then why is Abraham being blessed by him? Who is Tzedek? Is this another name for Yahweh? Are Yahweh and Tzedek maybe the same in the Israelite thinking? In Israel, again, just the name gets you into all these areas that are just really gnarly. They're not easy. Second example, if the Messianic priesthood is from Melchizedek, okay, this is Psalm 110 stuff now, why do we have an Aaronic priesthood? Other than Psalm 110, where does this idea even come from? In other words, where did the psalmist get it? I mean, the guy who's writing Psalm 110, where does he get this idea? Because we don't have a priesthood of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, in the Torah. We have the Aaronic, the priesthood of Aaron in the Torah. And a sub-issue is where's the link to the line, of Abraham in Genesis 14? I mean, you just get all sorts of these complications when it comes to this person. DDD, for example, Dictionary of Deities and Demons, says this about Psalm 110, at least some of the Psalm 110 material. It says Melchizedek's priesthood is defined as, or the person in Psalm 110, this kingly figure, his priesthood is defined as in or after the manner of Melchizedek. The exact meaning of this phrase is hard to establish. It's a nice understatement from DDD. Continuing, it says, it may mean in the line of Melchizedek, in other words, inheriting the priesthood of Melchizedek. It could mean like Melchizedek or on account of Melchizedek as well. Probably the formula shows that the kings of Israel, beginning with David, inherited the tradition of the priest king or pre-Israelite Jerusalem. This connection between kingship and priesthood apparently did not last very long, since no king of Judah is called priest and allusions to priestly conduct are limited to David and Solomon. You get a few episodes like the 2 Samuel 6:14, verse 18, 2 Samuel 24:17, 1 Kings 8:14, and 8:56. So you get a few references to David and Solomon doing priestly kinds of things, but you don't have that with anybody else. And if beginning with David, you have this inheritance of this other priestly line, why did it go away? Was there something wrong with it? Why, and again, back to why do we have an Aaronic priesthood? Why in Israelite history is there no tradition after Solomon? And even there's really not a tradition even for David and Solomon that they were viewed as king priests. Why is that? There just seems to be some disconnect going on here. Third example, Hebrews 7. Elements of that, as I mentioned, can't be found in Genesis 14 or Psalm 110 or even Second Temple Judaism. You get a portrayal of Melchizedek and Philo, you get Josephus talking about him, and you get a text that's especially interesting called 11Q Melchizedek. This is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a non-biblical scroll. That one is really interesting because in that text, 11Q Melchizedek, it's also called 11Q13 in the numbering system. Melchizedek is considered to be the God, Lord of the Council of Psalm 82. Now, again, anybody who knows the material we do in the podcast, Psalm 82, the Divine Council stuff, is going to know what Psalm 82 is about. Well, 11Q Melchizedek has Melchizedek as being the one who presides over the council. Now, that in and of itself is just kind of crazy, kind of bizarre. I'll read DDD again because it comments on this text too. In the Qumran text, Melchizedek is mentioned twice. Once in 1Q AP Genesis 22, that's the Genesis Apocryphon, which again is sort of a version of Genesis 14 events, and also in 11Q Melchizedek, which consists of 13 fragments. In that text, Melchizedek plays a central role. The many gaps, the lacunae in the text make a conclusive interpretation virtually impossible. The text has the form of an eschatological midrash, in other words, sort of an eschatological riff, on Psalm 82, in which the liberation prophesied in Isaiah 61 is described in terms of the restoration of property during the year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25, and the deliverer is Melchizedek, who is the Elohim of Psalm 82. So you got 11Q Melchizedek drawing stuff from Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes, remember, when he's at the synagogue, this day this has been fulfilled, and, setting the captives free and all that stuff. 11Q Melchizedek quotes that passage, Leviticus 25, and Psalm 82, and puts Melchizedek right in the middle of that. So that raises the question, is Melchizedek, to some Jews, was he the Lord of the council? How does that jive with Genesis 14? Did the Jew who wrote 11Q Melchizedek, didn't he read Genesis 4? I mean, how do you get there? Again, on one hand, 11Q Melchizedek shows us Jews could think, though, in terms of a God king who was also a priest. Now, that sounds suspiciously like Jesus, doesn't it? But again, this is a secular, a non-biblical, it's not part of the Bible, text, but it's a text among the Dead Sea Scrolls that was interpreting certain passages in the Old Testament in ways that the New Testament interpreted certain Old Testament passages thinking about Jesus. Again, so 11Q Melchizedek has drawn a lot of attention, but you don't have a specific alignment between it and like Hebrews 7. You just don't. You have a few points of contact, maybe touch points, but they don't really sort of interact with each other. And obviously they can't because Hebrews 7 is written much later, but you get similar kinds of flavoring to it. I mean, I could go on and on. Let's one more last phrase here. This whole idea of without beginning or end. What do we do with that? Well, there are, in other Greek literature, the same words there, the vocabulary there. Those terms do get used of divine beings in other Greek texts. And so that creates, again, the question of, okay, is Melchizedek to be viewed as divine here, as a divine being, non-human, or at least more than human, that sort of thing? Is this a clue? And if it is, how is that consistent with Genesis 14 and Psalm 110? Maybe, again, this is just one proposal, we're just throwing stuff out here. Maybe Melchizedek and the Son of God, Jesus, maybe there's a type-antitype thing going on here. Maybe the point of Hebrews 7 isn't to do exegesis in Genesis 14 or in Psalm 110. Maybe all he's trying to do is strike analogies. And maybe he's thinking those two things, the Son of God, Jesus, and Melchizedek, are analogical because of Jewish traditions that we see in 11Q Melchizedek, where you have a divine, kingly, priestly sort of figure there. In other words, that whole set of ideas was part of at least, some Jewish thinking between the Testaments. And so maybe the writer of Hebrews, again, understood that or had been exposed to that and says, aha, I've got the real answer here. And the real answer is in an analogous relationship between Melchizedek and Jesus. And to really throw a wrench into this, some would say, well, he's not really doing the analogy between the Melchizedek of the Old Testament and Jesus. He's doing the analogy between Jesus and 11Q Melchizedek itself, which would really throw a curveball into things. So again, this is an extremely complicated subject that we'll return to this, and we'll do 2 episodes on it, because there's so much here that you can't really do it justice or really resolve anything in a Q&A.